uh, ask the most simple questions. It reveals important problems in biology, and no more so than the brain. Now, a simple question: why is the brain in two halves? Look, I'm drawing a brain cut down the middle as if you were looking at the brain from the front. And what you see are two halves called the cerebral hemispheres, together with the cortex, which is looks like a bark of a tree around the major part of the cerebrum, and there are these great pyramidal cells. Actually, I put one here. Are connected to another great pyramidal cell, that side of the brain, and there's between the two there is a wire, if you like, call it a nerve fibre, which is heavily myelinated with myelin for the reasons that I want to explain my way. But there are something like 30,000 of these wires going from one side of the brain to the other like that. But they all go through what's called a corpus callosum. Actually, my ancestor by marriage, Sir Christopher Wren, when he was a young architect, he took on a job to illustrate the first book of the anatomy of the brain, written by a guy called Thomas Willis, who actually lived in Oxford and was at the university there. And he drew a picture of the corpus callosum from underneath, which is not the way you normally see it. Normally you see it from the side, a kind of sagittal section, whereas if you do a coronal section, you'll see it a different way. But in the middle of these the brain's hemispheres, they're packed with what are called glial cells. Glial cells are the ones which create the energy by means of creating ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And those are the cells which use up most of the oxygen, or 40% of the oxygen breathed in by our bodies goes to power up these cells. Now, these cells are generating a phenomenal amount of energy. And that energy is going to these pyramidal cells in order to change their polarity. Because what you find is that when that cell is positively charged, its partner on the other side of the cerebrum is negatively charged. So you've got now a situation where you've got a positive charge here and a negative charge here, and they switch around and they connect with each other. One pyramidal cell connects with another one. There's 6 layers of connection here in the cerebral cortex. It's called the cortex because that's the Latin word for bark. Anyway, so that is basically the brain, and it's the brain of every mammal, every mammalian, any animal kingdom species has got a system like this. And what I'm going to say now is going to astonish biologists, because I don't think I've ever heard anybody else say it, but this is a communication system. This is a radiator. It will radiate these changes up and down fast as they can go into a kind of lake called the third and it's the ventricle. A ventricle is like a little hole, but it's hole filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And all these radiations from the corpus callosum bathed in this lake here. And that lake connects the rest of the spinal system. So what you've actually got is, because you know that fluids and water can carry electrical charges, you've got a system whereby these radiations are generated into the cerebrospinal fluid and therefore can get pretty well everywhere. But now back to the myelin. The reason for the myelin sheathing around each of these discrete fibers, they're all separated, is because, like any radio mast, they get hot with transmissions. And in order to protect them from melting is this myelin sheath. And you see that going wrong when you look at what happens with sudden infant death syndrome. Sudden infant death syndrome is where these myelin sheaths are found to have melted off, and they're recoagulated in the third and lateral ventricle that I've just described. Now, that was discovered by Professor Emery many years ago, and I did write to him and say, look, the reason is because the brain is having to generate signals higher than normal because the brain is subjected to a poor signal-to-noise ratio, and the reason for that is because that infant has been sleeping in an abnormally high electric field, and therefore the importance of sending these signals, in order to override the noise around the infant, the brain gets too hot, the myelin can't handle it. We're basically, all human beings are born with a demyelinated, we haven't actually myelinated our brain when we get born, so it's thin anyway, if at all. And that is what has caused the cot death, because the whole system crashes. Okay, so that is what I'm talking about when I say that the human body can act as a radiator. And I hope you understand what I'm trying to say, even though it's pretty crudely drawn out here. And that is a very important and new idea in biology, which deserves serious scientific attention by means of examination of the existing scientific literature, which I've done, and by performing experiments to test this hypothesis, which other people will do in due course, no doubt. Well, that's my second point, and I'll go on from there in my next part of this talk. Thanks for listening. investigations into biological codes. Earlier I had said that it was an area which hadn't been investigated rigorously or seriously by science, but actually that's not quite true, because there has been quite a lot of research done into this area by the military of several countries, and they have probably acquired a level of knowledge which is not available to mainstream science. And there are some examples of this. For example, in World War II, before we developed what are called ELF communication systems with submarines, it's said that the base at the Kola Peninsula, the Russian submarine base at the Kola Peninsula, used to keep rabbits, the mothers, I believe, in the Kola Peninsula, the mother rabbits, and the babies on board submarines. And when important signals needed to be sent from one or the other, they would kill the baby rabbits, and then the effect of that was to make the mother rabbit, so many hundreds of, if not thousands of miles away, extremely excited, as if the communication system between progeny and parent could create that kind of response. So, I mean, that was the way that the Russians were using it. And of course, we all believe that that the Battle of Britain was won by the glorious few fighter pilots, but they actually